What if everything you thought you knew about belonging could be taken from you in an instant? Ezra Carter was used to navigating spaces that weren't built for him. He knew the unspoken rules, the silent glances, the weight of proving again and again that he belonged. But at 35,000 feet, in a first-class seat he had paid for, he learned a lesson far older than the plane carrying him through the sky. Some people don't need proof to believe you don't belong. When a flight attendant ordered him to move to economy without checking his ticket, the choice before him wasn't just about a seat, it was about dignity, about power, about the weight of silence. What followed was a confrontation that would shake the very foundation of those unspoken rules, forcing everyone from the flight crew to the passengers watching in quiet complicity to reckon with the truth. What happens when the people who make the rules are forced to question them? What happens when justice demands more than an apology? And most importantly, if this had happened to you, what would you do? Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us because this story is just beginning. Let's dive in. Ezra stepped onto the plane with a quiet kind of confidence, the kind you build over years of learning how to move through the world without causing ripples. He wasn't new to this. He had traveled before, understood the unspoken codes of airports, the silent gazes that flickered over him when he stepped into spaces people didn't expect him to belong. The air in first class was different, cooler, quieter, the kind of hush that money bought. He moved carefully, as he always did, nodding politely at the older gentleman who glanced up from his newspaper as Ezra passed. A woman in pearls adjusted her silk scarf, side-eyeing him before returning to her glass of champagne. Ezra ignored it. He had paid for this seat. He had the right to be here. But the moment he sank into the plush leather, he felt it, a shift, a ripple, a presence hovering too long. He turned his head and met the hard eyes of the flight attendant standing over him. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable except for the tight line of her lips. "You need to move," she said. The words dropped like a stone into his stomach. Ezra blinked. "Excuse me? This seat is not for you," she said, her voice laced with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "You need to move to the economy section." Ezra's heart began a slow, heavy thump against his ribs. He inhaled carefully, keeping his voice even. "There's been a mistake," he said, pulling out his boarding pass. "This is my seat." The flight attendant barely looked at it. "Sir, you need to move." Ezra could feel it now, the silence stretching, the weight of a dozen unseen gazes settling onto him. The couple across the aisle had gone very still. A businessman a few rows ahead flipped a page in his magazine, pretending not to listen. The air in the cabin thickened, pressing down on him. He could argue. He could demand that she check the manifest. He could refuse to move. But the calculation happened instantly in his mind, the years of experience, of watching how these things played out. A scene would unfold. Voices would rise. Someone would call security. And at 30,000 feet, there were no allies. Ezra swallowed, his grip tightening around the strap of his bag. This was the game, the unspoken rules. You could be right, but that didn't mean you wouldn't lose. He stood. The humiliation burned as he made the slow walk to economy, past the rows of indifferent faces, past the ones who had seen everything and would say nothing. The seat in economy was smaller, the space more cramped. He sat down, fingers digging into his thighs as he forced himself to steady his breath. His phone buzzed. "Dad, everything okay? Boarded yet?" Ezra hesitated before typing. "They made me move, said I couldn't sit in first class." The response came almost immediately. "Dad, who made you move?" Ezra stared at the screen, his pulse hammering. He could almost hear his father's voice, not angry, not yet, just cold, calculating. "Flight attendant." A long pause. Then, "Dad, what's the flight number?" Ezra exhaled slowly. He knew what was coming. His father was not the kind of man who let things slide. But what could he do? The plane was already in the air. Up front, the flight attendant, Julia, stirred her coffee without a second thought. To her, it was just another seating adjustment. Just another passenger redirected to where he was supposed to be. But Hannah, another attendant, had been watching. "You checked the manifest, right?" Hannah asked, voice low. Julia rolled her eyes. "Didn't need to." Hannah frowned. "That guy had a first-class ticket." Julia shrugged. "Probably a mistake. You know how these things happen." Before Hannah could press further, the intercom crackled. "Miss Julia, Report to the cockpit immediately. Julia stiffened. The captain never called unless something serious was happening. She set down her coffee and smoothed her uniform, heels clicking against the floor as she walked toward the cockpit. Inside, Captain Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair. His face was unreadable, but Julia's eyes went straight to the screen in front of him. A man's face stared back at her sharp features. Dark skin, a look of quiet fury. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, controlled, but the weight behind it sent a chill through her spine. You removed my son from his assigned seat. Julia's breath caught. You told him he didn't belong. The silence was deafening. Would you like to explain why? For the first time in her career, Julia was speechless. The man on the screen didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to crush the flimsy excuses forming in her throat. She had made a mistake. No, a decision. And now, she was going to face the consequences. Ezra sat in the cramped economy seat, his shoulders brushing against the armrests, his knees pressed uncomfortably close to the seat in front of him. It was smaller, tighter, a world away from the space and ease of first class. But it wasn't the discomfort of the seat that weighed on him. It was the silence of the passengers around him, those who had seen what happened but said nothing, the silence of the flight attendant, who had moved on as if erasing him from first class had been as routine as handing out a drink menu. The silence that wrapped itself around him now. A familiar, suffocating thing. His phone buzzed again. Dad. What's the flight number? Ezra hesitated. His father didn't react to injustice with outrage. He wielded power like a surgeon wielded a scalpel. Cutting precisely, cleanly. But Ezra knew what was coming. He had seen it before. He typed the flight number and hit send. A beat of quiet. Then, Dad. Stay in your seat. I'm handling this. Ezra exhaled slowly, gripping the phone. Something was coming. At 35,000 feet. Power still moves. Up in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds listened in silence as the voice on the screen Richard Carter. The airline's owner spoke with the measured tone of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. You removed my son from his seat, Carter said. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to raise it. The weight of his words did the work. Captain Reynolds kept his expression neutral. But Julia, the flight attendant standing beside him, shifted uncomfortably. Would you like to explain why? Carter continued. Julia's mouth opened, then shut. It was a mistake. That was what she wanted to say. But it wasn't, was it? It had been a choice. She had looked at Ezra and made a decision without checking the manifest. Without verifying his ticket. Just instinct. As natural as blinking. And now, here she was. Carter let the silence stretch. He wanted her to sit in it. To feel it. Did you ask anyone else in first class to prove they belonged there? Julia swallowed hard. No, she hadn't. Carter's voice was calm, but unrelenting. You assumed. The truth of it hit her like turbulence, sudden, jarring, inescapable. Here's what's going to happen. Carter continued. You will personally return to my son and escort him back to first class. You will apologize. Julia clenched her jaw. The humiliation of it burned. But this wasn't a request. Carter's voice dropped lower, quieter. And when this plane lands, we will have another conversation. The call cut off. For a moment, the only sound in the cockpit was the soft hum of the aircraft. The steady beep of instruments. Captain Reynolds turned to Julia. His expression unreadable. You heard him. The long walk back. Ezra saw her before she reached him. She moved stiffly, each step measured, controlled, a woman caught between duty and consequence. Passengers turned their heads as she stopped beside his seat. There was a mistake, she said, voice clipped. You may return to your original seat. Ezra didn't move. He studied her the way her hands clenched at her sides. The rigid set of her shoulders. The tightness in her jaw. He could make this hard for her. He could ask her to say it again. Louder, so that the entire cabin could hear. He could ask her why. Why she had done it. Why she hadn't checked. Why she had looked at him and decided that he did not belong. But he already knew the answer. So instead, he simply stood, adjusting the strap of his bag. As he moved back up the aisle, the shift in the air was palpable. People who had watched him leave now avoided his gaze. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others pretended nothing had happened at all. Guilt, embarrassment, fear. It was all there, unspoken. Ezra settled back into his original seat, the leather still warm from the body that had briefly taken his place. He wasn't sure what he had expected, some kind of satisfaction. Maybe, but all he felt was a tired kind of clarity. Julia lingered beside him. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter. "Can I get you anything?" Ezra looked up at her. "You didn't ask me that before," he said simply. Julia stiffened. "Excuse me? When I first sat here," Ezra continued, "you didn't greet me. You didn't offer me a drink. You didn't treat me like the others in first class." The silence stretched again. A slow, dawning discomfort settled on her face. "I apologize," she said finally. Ezra let the moment stretch, watching her shift uncomfortably under the weight of it. Then, at last, he nodded. "I'll take a sparkling water." Julia turned quickly, disappearing down the aisle. Ezra sat back, his fingers tracing the stitching on the armrest. This wasn't over. Not yet. Ezra sipped the sparkling water slowly, letting the bubbles rise and burst against his tongue. He wasn't thirsty. He just wanted to make her wait. Julia stood stiffly beside his seat, her hands clenched around the tray. The tension in her shoulders, the tight line of her mouth, Ezra recognized it for what it was. She wanted to be anywhere but here. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. Her voice clipped, strained at the edges. Ezra met her gaze, held it. "No," he said, setting the glass down carefully on the tray table. "I think I have everything I need." She gave a terse nod and turned on her heel, walking quickly down the aisle. But Ezra knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Turbulence in the air, and elsewhere. At first, the flight continued as if nothing had happened. The hum of the engines, the rhythmic clink of glasses, the low murmur of hushed conversations. But there was a shift now. A kind of ripple through the cabin that Ezra could feel pressing against his skin. Eyes darting toward him, then away. The couple across the aisle whispering behind raised hands. The older man with the newspaper glancing over the rim of his glasses before quickly looking back down. Pretending to read. People had seen what happened, and now they didn't know what to do with it. Ezra had seen this kind of thing before. The discomfort of those who bore witness but did not intervene. The ones who would later tell themselves, "It wasn't my place. It wasn't my fight. It was easier that way." A sudden jolt rocked the plane, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." A few gasps. Someone clutched the armrest, but Ezra barely noticed, because Julia had just been called back to the cockpit. A reckoning at 35,000 feet. The cockpit was dimly lit, filled with the steady beeping of controls, the soft glow of blinking lights. Captain Reynolds was watching her carefully, but it was the voice on the intercom, deep, unshaken, and waiting, that made Julia's stomach twist. Richard Carter. He hadn't called back to scold. He hadn't called back to lecture. No, this was something else. "Miss Julia," Carter said, his voice calm, precise, "I trust you've corrected your mistake." Julia's throat was dry. "Yes, sir." "Good," he said. A pause. Then, "Now let's talk about what happens next." A cold wave of dread settled over her. She started, but Carter cut her off. "You made a decision," he said, his voice still even. "A decision based not on policy. Not on protocol but on something else entirely. And I have to wonder, Miss Julia, how many other decisions like this you've made?" The words struck like a blow. Because it wasn't just Ezra. She thought back through years of flights. Passengers. Tiny interactions that had barely registered at the time. The man she had asked twice to show his boarding pass. The woman whose bag she had inspected while others passed freely. The way she spoke to some travelers with warmth and to others with clipped efficiency. It had never been intentional. Not in the way people thought of racism. Not in the way the history books described it. It had been small things. Quiet things. But here she was, standing under the weight of it, unable to argue against the simple fact that she had looked at Ezra and assumed. "You will file a full report when the flight lands," Carter continued. "A report on this incident. And on your own behavior." She swallowed. "Yes, sir. And one more thing," Carter added, his voice suddenly sharp. "You will ensure that, for the remainder of this flight, my son receives the same courtesy, the same respect, and the same service as every other first-class passenger." A silence. Then, "Yes, sir." The call ended with a soft click. Julia exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle onto her shoulders. She had made a decision, and now she would have to live with it. An uneasy peace. Ezra knew the moment she returned that something had shifted. She moved differently now, more careful, more measured, her voice softer when she asked the other passengers if they needed anything. The way she set down a drink in front of a businessman. The way she adjusted the blanket for the elderly woman 2 rows ahead different. She stopped beside him again. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Carter?" she asked. "Mr. Carter." Ezra studied her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I'm fine." She nodded and moved on. But Ezra could feel it in the air change. The kind that didn't come easy. The kind that unsettled people. Made them rethink things they had never questioned before. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was a start. The plane sailed through the sky. Steady. Unbothered. But inside the cabin, tension twisted and curled between the seats like an unseen current. Ezra sat still. His body relaxed. But his mind was sharp. Restless. Julia had corrected her mistake, if you could call it that. She had returned him to his rightful place. Softened her voice. Offered him water. She had done what was necessary. But necessary was not enough. Because beneath all of this, the polished politeness, the stiff apologies, the silence that followed, there was something deeper. Something unresolved. And Ezra was tired of pretending not to see it. The questions no one asks. "Excuse me." The voice was hesitant, uncertain. Ezra turned to see the older man across the aisle. The one who had been reading the newspaper earlier. He had folded it now. His hands resting on top of it. Fingers tapping against the print. The man cleared his throat. "I saw what happened earlier," he said. I wanted to say I'm sorry. That wasn't right." Ezra studied him. The man looked uncomfortable. Like he had been sitting on those words for too long and now they had grown too heavy to keep inside. Ezra nodded once. "I appreciate that." A pause. The man shifted in his seat. "She probably didn't mean anything by it," he said finally. Ezra exhaled slowly. And there it was. The thing no one ever said out loud but always lingered in the air, the quiet plea for absolution. The attempt to smooth over the rough edges of what had just happened. To make it smaller, easier to digest. The words rested between them. Fragile. Ezra leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something," he said, his voice even. "If she had looked at someone else, someone who looked more like you, do you think she would have made the same mistake?" The man opened his mouth. Then closed it. Ezra nodded. "Exactly." The silence stretched. The older man glanced down. Pressing his lips together, he picked up his newspaper again but didn't open it. Ezra turned back to the window. No more disguises. Julia moved through the cabin. Her motions mechanical. She felt their eyes on her. Not just Ezra's, but the others too, the ones who had seen. Who had whispered. Who had chosen silence. She had been working flights for years. She knew how to read a room. And right now, she was trapped in one that was turning against her. The truth was, she had never been challenged like this before. Not in a way that made her question herself. She had always thought of herself as fair. Professional. She followed the rules. She treated passengers well. But now, she couldn't stop hearing Carter's voice in the cockpit. "How many other decisions like this have you made? How many times had she assumed? How many times had she mistaken prejudice for protocol?" Her stomach twisted. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, Ezra spoke. "Miss Julia." She turned, startled. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said. Her breath caught. "Excuse me?" I said. "Sit down." He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Let's talk." The words were casual, but there was weight in them. A challenge. Passengers turned, sensing the shift in energy. Julia hesitated. She could refuse. She could walk away. But then what? So, slowly, stiffly, she lowered herself into the seat beside him. Ezra turned to her fully now. "I have a question for you," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly." Julia's pulse quickened. "Why did you do it?" A choice, laid bare. She opened her mouth, the usual explanations rising to her lips. "I was just following protocol. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean anything by it." But none of that would hold up. Not here. Not now. Ezra waited. And suddenly, it was unbearable the way he was looking at her. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with something worse. Expectation. She swallowed hard. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra's gaze didn't waver. Yes, you do, he said quietly. The truth pushed at the edges of her consciousness. Dark and sharp. It terrified her. She had seen him young, black, alone in first class, and she had assumed. And because no one had stopped her, because no one had questioned her, because the system had always supported those assumptions, she had acted on it without hesitation. Ezra leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. You didn't think I belonged, he said. That's the truth, isn't it? Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And he was right. Julia felt something crack open inside her, something raw and ugly that she had never dared to look at before. She had always thought of racism as something distant, something loud and obvious, something that happened in other places, in other times, committed by other people. Not her. Never her. But here she was, sitting beside a man she had wronged, realizing, with a nauseating certainty, that she had been part of the problem all along. No easy endings. Ezra watched her carefully, saw the way her face shifted, the way her breath quickened. He didn't let her off the hook. He wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for understanding. Julia stared at her hands, her thoughts spinning, colliding. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, I'm sorry. Ezra nodded. Slow. Now what are you going to do about it? The question hung between them. Passengers were still watching. The hum of the plane filled the silence. Julia didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time, she was starting to realize this wasn't just about one moment, one mistake, one conversation. This was about all the other times she had looked without seeing. And now, there was no going back. For a moment, Julia sat frozen in the seat beside Ezra. Her breath shallow, her pulse quick. She had spent her entire career navigating turbulence storms that rattled the cabin. Air pockets that sent drinks spilling. Emergencies that demanded quick, decisive action. But nothing had ever shaken her quite like this. Because turbulence passed, it was something external, something temporary. Though this was different. This was the kind of storm that didn't just shake you. It exposed you. Ezra's question still hung in the air between them. Heavy, unrelenting. Now what are you going to do about it? She wanted to look away. But she couldn't. Because deep down, she already knew the real danger wasn't in being wrong. The real danger was in pretending it didn't matter. Unmasking the quiet complicity. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper pretended to read. A woman 3 rows up shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The murmurs had faded, but the weight of unspoken thoughts still pressed down on the cabin. They were all watching now. Listening without meaning to. It was the way things always happened, wasn't it? People bore witness but never intervened. They absorbed moments like this, packed them away in quiet corners of their memory, only to recount them later with a shake of the head, a sigh, a quiet acknowledgement of injustice. But not action. Never action. Julia realized, with an almost physical jolt, that she had spent years being one of those people. She wasn't just the flight attendant who had moved Ezra from his seat. She was also every bystander who had let things like this happen before. And now, here she was exposed under the sharp clarity of a question she could not answer. Her fingers curled into her lap. Ezra was still watching her. The uneasy truth about power. Miss Julia. The voice wasn't Ezra's this time. It was another passenger, a woman sitting 2 rows ahead. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf. She turned slightly, looking at Julia with something close to curiosity. You were so sure of yourself earlier, the woman said. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. Why so quiet now? A hush rippled through the cabin. Julia's stomach tightened. She glanced at Ezra, at the other passengers, and for the first time, she felt something unfamiliar creeping in, something far worse than discomfort. Exposure. She swallowed. I made a mistake. The older woman raised an eyebrow. Which part? The question landed like a blow. Because the truth was, it wasn't just about this one moment. It wasn't about Ezra, or the seat, or the boarding pass she hadn't bothered to check. It was about all the small moments that had come before. All the times she had mistaken prejudice for professionalism. All the times she had enforced rules without questioning why they existed. All the times she had looked at someone and assumed. She could feel it now, the weight of it pressing against her chest. Thick and suffocating. Ezra didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence did the work for him. The captain's call. Up in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds glanced at the blinking light on his dashboard. The in-flight phone was ringing again. He already knew who it was. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Mr. Carter." The voice on the other end was composed, even, but there was an unmistakable finality to it. "We'll be discussing this in greater detail when the flight lands," Carter said, "but in the meantime, I trust that your crew will handle this situation properly." Reynolds felt the warning beneath those words. He had been flying planes for decades. He had seen complaints get swept under the rug, stories get rewritten, truths get distorted by technicalities. But not this time. Not with a man like Richard Carter waiting at the other end of the runway. "Yes, sir," Reynolds said, his voice tight. "We'll handle it. Landing, but not home yet." The final hours of the flight crawled by. Julia avoided Ezra's gaze, though she could feel it. Steady and unflinching, she went through the motions, handing out drinks, checking on passengers, but everything felt different now, fragile, uneasy. She had never been more aware of herself. Every step she took, every glance, every word, it all felt like it carried more weight now. And maybe that was the point. The seatbelt sign dinged on. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. "We'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seats are in their upright position and that all carry-on items are securely stored." Ezra exhaled slowly. Soon, the wheels would touch the ground. But he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The walk of reckoning. The plane landed with a soft jolt. The usual rustling of seat belts clicking open filling the air. Passengers shifted, stretching, gathering their things. Ezra remained seated. He didn't have to wait long. As soon as the door opened, a uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. And he didn't hesitate. He walked past the first-class passengers, past the businessmen and the couples and the families waiting to disembark until he stopped in front of Julia. "Miss Julia," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you'll need to come with us." A hush spread through the cabin. Julia's breath caught. "Is this really necessary?" The officer didn't blink. "Mr. Carter has requested a formal review of the incident." Julia's pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced at Ezra, but he said nothing. He simply watched. Passengers whispered. Eyes followed as she stood, gathering her things with shaking hands. She forced herself to straighten her back, to walk with purpose, but the weight of every gaze, every hushed murmur, pressed down on her like an anchor. This wasn't just about what had happened on this flight. This was about the way things always happened. And now, for the first time, she was the one being held accountable. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the cold air hitting her like a slap. And as she walked forward, flanked by the officers, she realized this was only the beginning. The airport terminal buzzed with movement. A sea of weary travelers dragging suitcases, scrolling through their phones, heading toward exits that led them back to their separate, waiting lives. But Julia was going nowhere. She sat in a small, windowless conference room deep within the airport's administrative wing, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and bureaucracy. And the ticking wall clock counted down the minutes to whatever awaited her next. Across from her sat a man she had only seen in news articles and corporate memos, Richard Carter. Ezra's father, the man who owned the airline, and the man who was now looking at her with the kind of silence that demanded more than words could provide. She was not the first person to sit here, in this chair, waiting for a decision to be made about her future. But she had the sinking feeling that what was about to happen was something different. Because this wasn't just about a single mistake. This was about all the mistakes before it. Truth measured in heartbeats. "You've been with the airline for how long?" Carter finally asked, his voice as steady as his gaze. 7 years, Julia answered, though her voice was thinner than she wanted it to be. Carter nodded. He already knew the answer. He wasn't asking because he needed the information. He was asking because he wanted her to hear it, wanted her to feel the weight of it. 7 years, he repeated, and in those 7 years, how many passengers like my son have you made assumptions about? Julia flinched. The question was like a blade, cutting through all the defenses she had been trying to build since stepping off that plane. "I don't know," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "Think harder," Carter said, and his voice, though still calm, held something sharper now, something with edges. Julia swallowed, fingers tightening against her lap. She wanted to say never. She wanted to say Ezra was the first. But that would be a lie. And they both knew it. The things we do without thinking. She thought back to the moments she had once dismissed as minor, insignificant. The way she had double-checked certain passengers' tickets but not others. The way she had been warmer to some travelers and colder to others. The way she had enforced the rules selectively, never with malice, but always with instinct. And that instinct, now exposed under the weight of Carter's gaze, felt like something much uglier than she had ever dared to admit. She took a slow, unsteady breath. "I've made mistakes," she said finally. Carter didn't blink. "Yes," he said, "you have." Silence again. Then, "Why should I let you keep your job?" Julia's breath caught. She had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud, so plainly, sent a cold spike of fear through her chest. She had always been the one enforcing the rules. She had never been the one on the other side of them. And now she understood more than she ever had before how little power you had when someone decided you didn't belong. The uncomfortable offer. "I don't expect you to," Julia admitted. Carter leaned back slightly, considering her. "Do you want to know why I called you here?" he asked. Julia hesitated. "To fire me?" Carter almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No," he said. "If I wanted you fired, you'd be gone already." That should have been a relief. It wasn't. "Then why am I here?" Carter let the silence stretch, making sure she felt it, before answering. "Because change doesn't happen by getting rid of people who make mistakes." His voice was quiet but firm. "It happens when those people learn to do better." Julia exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing only slightly. "I want you to go through training," Carter continued. "Real training, not the kind that lets you check a box and say you did it. The kind that forces you to sit with your own discomfort. The kind that makes you answer hard questions." Julia nodded, unsure of what else to say. Carter studied her for a long moment before adding, "And after that, you'll come back, on probation, a second chance, but not an easy one. And certainly not one without consequences." Julia felt something in her chest loosen, not relief. Not quite, but something close. Because this was the cost of belonging. Not a single apology. Not a single moment of discomfort. But the work. The real work. And for the first time, she realized this wasn't just about Ezra. It was about all the Ezras before him. All the ones she hadn't seen. All the ones she had ignored. And all the ones she would have to answer to, if she was ever going to earn her place back. The training room was small and bare, with walls the color of old paper and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. There were no windows, no distractions, just a single long table, a few chairs, and the heavy silence that settled between the people sitting there. Julia had never been on this side of a corporate training session before. She had administered them, yes. She had guided new hires through policy after policy, walked them through the scripts they were supposed to follow, the procedures that kept the machine of the airline running smoothly. But this was different. This wasn't a script. This was a reckoning, a mirror held too close. Across from her sat a man named David, an instructor with a tired face and sharp eyes that had seen too much. He had been leading these sessions for years, had seen every reaction under the sun, the defensiveness, the anger, the tears that came too late. And Julia knew, without him saying a word, that he was measuring her now. Waiting. "So, let's start with what happened," David said, his voice even, controlled. "Tell me, in your own words." Julia swallowed, feeling the weight of the question press down on her. She could dress it up. She could make it sound like a misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment. She could blame fatigue, stress, the pressures of the job. But she had a feeling none of that would matter. She cleared her throat. "I removed a passenger from first class," she said, "without checking his ticket. I assumed," she hesitated, forcing herself to look at David. "I assumed he didn't belong there." David didn't react. He just nodded, waiting for more. Julia exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. "I thought I was following the rules," she continued. "I've seen people try to sneak into first class before. I thought that was what was happening." David tapped his pen against the table. "And what made you think that this time?" Julia looked away. She already knew the answer. But saying it out loud felt like setting fire to something she couldn't put back together. David leaned forward slightly. "It's important that you say it," he said, his voice gentler now. Julia's fingers curled. "Because he was black," she said finally. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into deep water. David nodded. "Good," he said, though his voice carried no kindness. "That's the truth. Now, what are you going to do with it? The weight of what comes next." For the next 3 hours, Julia sat through stories. Stories from passengers who had been followed through airports for no reason. Stories from flight attendants who had been overlooked, passed up for promotions, dismissed when they spoke up. Stories of split-second decisions that had changed people's lives in ways they could never undo. She listened, and for the first time, she truly heard, because it was never just about Ezra. It was about the way these things piled up, layer after layer, until they became something too heavy to carry alone. David set down his pen, watching her carefully. "Most people walk away from this room exactly the same as when they walked in," he said. "They learn the right words to say, the right answers to give, but nothing really changes." Julia stared at him. "And the ones who don't?" David shrugged. "They burn for a while," he said, "because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and if you're really paying attention, it'll tear you apart before it makes you better." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "So the real question, Julia, is whether you're willing to burn the fire that burns clean." The first time Julia stepped back onto a plane, everything felt different. She had worked flights for years, moved through cabins without thinking, without questioning. She had handed out drinks, smiled at passengers, followed procedures. But now, she saw things she hadn't seen before. The way security eyed some passengers more than others. The way certain voices, certain complaints were dismissed without a second thought. The way people like her made snap judgments, never considering what those judgments cost the people on the receiving end. She felt raw, exposed, like she was seeing the world for the first time. And maybe she was. Ezra was on her mind more often than she wanted to admit. She had tried to push him away, to file him under lesson learned, incident resolved, but the truth was, he had forced her to see something about herself that she hadn't wanted to see. And there was no going back from that. A seat at the table. The next time Ezra flew, he almost didn't notice her. He had taken his seat in first class without a second thought. Flipping through the in-flight magazine, letting the soft hum of the engine settle around him. And then, "Mr. Carter." The voice was careful, measured. He looked up. Julia stood before him, her posture rigid but her eyes steady. She didn't fidget, didn't look away. Ezra arched an eyebrow. "Miss Julia." A pause. Then, "Can I get you anything?" she asked. He studied her. There was something different this time. Something he couldn't quite place. "Water," he said finally. She nodded, stepping away. Ezra watched as she moved through the cabin. Something quieter about her now. Something deliberate. He wasn't sure what had changed. But he could tell. She had burned. And maybe, just maybe, she had come out the other side. The thing about change, real change, is that it never comes easy. It does not arrive quietly in the night. Nor does it settle in with the comfort of a long-forgotten memory. It burns. It unsettles. It demands. And Julia had spent months learning this the hard way. She was back at work, wearing the same uniform, moving through the same narrow aisles, speaking the same rehearsed words to passengers who would forget her face the moment they stepped off the plane. But everything was different now. Because now, she saw how security guards lingered a little too long around black passengers at check-in. She saw how flight attendants, including herself, unconsciously softened their tones when speaking to white customers but sharpened their words when addressing others. She saw how people like Ezra Young, black, self-assured, were constantly asked, in ways both explicit and implicit, to prove they belonged. And what haunted her most was how easy it had been not to notice before. An uneasy peace. The first time she saw Ezra again, it wasn't in the air. It was on the ground. In an airport terminal. In the liminal space where people hurried between gates. Between flights. Between one version of their lives and another. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing near a cafe, scrolling through his phone, a carry-on bag resting against his leg. He looked as he had before, calm, composed, belonging. But Julia knew now that belonging was something he had to insist on. Over and over, in a world that too often refused to grant it freely. She could have walked away. Instead, she stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said. Ezra looked up, his expression unreadable. "Miss Julia." A pause stretched between them. filled with the ghost of everything that had happened. Julia exhaled. I didn't expect to see you again. Ezra smirked slightly. I fly often. Of course he did. Are you working this flight? He asked. Though she could tell he already knew the answer. She shook her head. No, just passing through. Another silence. And then, because she had been holding onto something for too long, because it had settled in her bones like an ache, she said, I need you to know something. Ezra didn't speak, but he waited. I wasn't just wrong that day. Julia continued. I was wrong for a long time before it. I let myself believe I was just following the rules. But the truth is I made the rules mean whatever I needed them to mean. Ezra studied her carefully. And now? Julia swallowed. Now I know better. Ezra tilted his head. Do you? She stiffened slightly. Because that was the question. Wasn't it? Not whether she had learned. Not whether she had reflected. But whether, in the moments that mattered, she would be different. Because change was not a thing you declared. It was a thing you proved. Julia nodded slowly. I'd like to think so. Ezra considered her for a moment longer. Then shrugged, shifting his weight slightly. Then I guess we'll see. The test. It came 2 months later. On a flight from Atlanta to Chicago. A full cabin. The hum of jet engines. The quiet murmur of passengers settling in. Julia moved through the aisle. Scanning. Observing. She had trained herself to see now. To watch for the things she had once ignored. And then, it happened. A black man, mid-40s, dressed in a suit, standing in the aisle near first class. Confused. Julia moved toward him. Sir, do you need assistance? The man frowned slightly, looking at his ticket. I think there's been a mistake. My seat is supposed to be in 2A. But there's someone already there. Julia's breath slowed. She turned to her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Kelly, who was standing beside the occupied seat, speaking in hushed tones to the white man who had taken it. Kelly looked at Julia and sighed. He says his ticket is for this seat. Kelly said. Julia arched an eyebrow. Did you check the manifest? Kelly hesitated. And in that hesitation, Julia knew. She turned to the seated passenger. Her voice level. Sir, may I see your boarding pass? The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Kelly as if expecting her to step in. But Kelly didn't move. After a beat, the man sighed and pulled out his pass. Julia took it, scanned it, and nodded. This ticket is for 12C, she said, handing it back. The man's jaw tightened. I must have misread it. Julia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Understandable, she said evenly. Let me help you find your seat. She stepped aside, waiting. The man stood, stiff, his movements deliberate, and as he walked past the black passenger, the real owner of the seat, he didn't apologize. Julia exhaled. Then she turned back to the man still standing in the aisle. Mr. Daniels, my apologies for the delay, she said, using the name she had read on the manifest. Please, take your seat. Can I bring you a drink to start your flight? Mr. Daniels looked at her carefully, measuring her, just as Ezra had. And then, after a moment, he nodded. Water, he said. Julia smiled, coming right up. The unfinished work. That night, after the flight, Julia sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at the dashboard. She had done what was right. But it had cost her something. Kelly had barely spoken to her after the incident. Some of the other flight attendants had cast sidelong glances, as if to say, why make trouble? Julia knew why. Because the real work of change wasn't just about correcting yourself. It was about standing against a tide that didn't want to move. It was about making choices. Not just once, but every day. It was about seeing and refusing to look away. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaled. Then she started the engine. There was still work to do.